Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. This is going to be about turning up the volume on your Lectora courses. We've got Adam Liebler here. Well, first of all, my name is Zach Batty, and I'm co-hosting here with Adam Liebler. Adam, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Zach. How are you doing today?
Doing very well. I appreciate you doing this and taking the time.
Of course, my pleasure.
So here shortly, I'm going to turn the time over to Adam, but just by way of reminder, we have everybody muted just so that there's not too much background noise. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them up, and Adam and I will both be looking at those. I'll try to answer the ones that I can, and then the ones that I can't, or the ones that Adam thinks is particularly interesting, then he'll answer online. So without further ado, we'll go from there.
Excellent. We did a webinar that was kind of the first part of this last month. That was sort of the basics of getting into Lectora and playing around and some of the ground level stuff. We went back through a lot of the eLearning Brothers blog posts and searched through that sort of stuff and you know kind of brought all that stuff up. Showed that to everybody. You guys should be able to see my screen now. It should have a nice orangey eLearning Brothers-ish background swirl there going on. Can you see that, Zach?
Yes, I've got that.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through. Since we kind of did the basics last time, I'm going to start to get into some of the advanced and intermediate ways that you can build and design inside of Lectora. Specifically, what we're going to be looking at is using actions and variables. And a lot of times when you say actions and variables to people who are relatively new to Lectora, they immediately tune you out, or they start throwing things at you and jumping up and down and screaming because it's intimidating. When you get in there and you start looking inside of Lectora, and I've got Lectora 16 pulled up here, and this is a non-responsive title. It's one of our little interaction templates. When you start looking in here and you look at all these actions, and you start messing around in the tools and looking at all the variables and all these things, it is daunting and it's intimidating. But that's also where the real power kind of lies in Lectora. And that's what gives you the ability to do all kinds of crazy, cool, interesting things. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look real quick at what is an action, and how is it something that's helpful and useful for you. And then we're going to look at what is a variable and how is that helpful and useful. How do those two things go together, actions and variables? And then I'm going to show you a couple of blog posts that are out there on the eLearning Brothers website that you can kind of go in and play around with. And sort of do some research on your own and use as a memory primer for what we talk about today. So real quick, Zach introduced me. I'm saying a lot, and that's suddenly occurring to me. The webinar today is only my second one at eLearning Brothers, though I've done a lot of other ones all over the place. I'm actually senior eLearning developer at eLearning Brothers. I work on the custom development team. I don't work specifically on the template side, though I do help them out, and I did build a lot of the templates on the Lectora that are up there for Lectora. So it's kind of, Lectora was the my starting rapid development tool. So it's got a place close to my heart. So I really love playing around in there, and I love teaching people about how they can do what they want to do in there, because a lot of people get frustrated with it, especially if they come from another tool that's timeline based, like Storyline or Activate or even Flash or Edge Animate. So it can be a completely different monster. Last week or last webinar again, we did talk about the Title Explorer and how to find your assets and how to bring assets in, and some layering works and how positioning works and things like that. So if we just jump right off from that, the next thing we want to look at is we've got some content added to the page. We've got buttons here, we've got images here, we've got some background, and I kind of like the whole flat design trend that's going on right now. So this is a good little interaction to start with. But now what we need to do is we need to be able to take all of these assets we've imported and all of these text boxes we've created. You'll see here we've got all these different little content groups over here. We've got some buttons going on. Um, but without actions and without variables, there's no way to tie this little image over here on the right that has a button to I want to display something on this content stage. So that's where actions and variables start to come into play, is linking when I do something, I want this to happen. So actions are pretty much made up of four parts. There are four basic elements to an action. I'm going to go up here and select this very first one on the page, go up here to my ribbon, and I'm going to click on action. When I have an action highlighted, this is, and I come up here to the properties ribbon, I click on action, this is what I get. And you'll see here, this looks like kind of three sections, but there's really four. This action is really two different things, action and target. So the first part of an action is the trigger. The trigger is what happens on this page, or what does my learner interact with that causes me to want to do something on this page. So does this happen when they rotate the device? Does this happen when I hide or show something on the page? Do I want to key this action to a keystroke, any key on the keyboard, or a specific, like if I want to tie this to the right arrow or the left arrow on the page, do I want to tie it to a swipe? So is this a mobile specific course, or is this an action I want to target just people on mobile devices? And the last one is timed interval. Do I want something to happen on a regular timed basis? There's another part to this trigger called delay, and we'll look at that in just a second. Another thing that you'll notice is these menus, this trigger menu, this variable menu, right, or this action menu, all of these will change based on where your action is. So you'll notice here at the page level, I don't have anything about clicks. And the reason I don't have anything about clicks is there's not really a clickable element that is the entire page. I could put a transparent button over the whole page, but really these actions, right, these triggers are just the triggers that would happen at a page level. If I go into something like a button, you'll notice now I've got different options. I've still got device rotation, and I've got on page show, which means when the page is shown. I've still got hide and show, but I've also now got mouse click, mouse enter, so when I mouse over something, mouse exit, and right mouse click. So all of these menus are context sensitive. They're generated based on what kind of action you're generating, what that action is attached to. You'll notice here, this page level one is right under the page. This button level one is right under the button. I can attach actions to images and to text boxes, and you'll notice that does give me a context-specific menu here. So that's our trigger. How do we initiate the action? How do we know when to start doing whatever it is we want to do? The next thing that we're going to look at is kind of the middle part, action and target. Okay, well, what is it that I want to do? If I meet this condition, if I hit a trigger, what do I want to happen? And this is the menu where there's all kinds of different things. We can go to a web page or go to another part in the course. We can close the course. We can hide and show other objects on the page. We can move and resize stuff. We can change contents. We talked about that a little bit in the last webinar. We can set a state for a button. We can generate pop-up messages. We'll come back to run action group in just a second. We could run JavaScript. If you're a coder and you want to run some JavaScript, we could do that. We could send an email. We could set completion status. If there is media on this page or at a parent level that's inherited, we'll also get the option to start, stop, toggle the play and pause, mute or unmute media. If there were no media on this page or accessible from where I'm at in the course, you probably won't even see these options in your menu as far as actions go. And that's important to remember. So if you're trying to access a piece of audio, a piece of video, or some sort of other multimedia, and you don't see these options, it may be disinherited from that page, or it may be that how your course is set up, you just don't have access to that media right now. So if you are expecting to see something in one of these menus, whether it's your trigger menu or your action menu. If it's in your trigger menu, look where your action is and make sure it's attached to the right item. If you're looking for something in your action menu that doesn't show up, make sure that that item, whatever it is inherited. And you can go to your page or your chapter, click on your inherit settings, and see if there's something that's just not propagating down that you want to be able to get to. So we've looked at trigger, what happens that makes me do something. We've looked at action, what is it that I want to do? And each action, and these are going to be different for every one of these, each action is going to have a target. In other words, this little section over here to the right of the action is going to change based on what my action is. Sometimes it's going to be go to, and then I choose. I can choose something from in the title. I can choose a separate page. If it's a web address, I can type in my address here. I can choose whether I want it to be an existing or a new window. I get some additional options once I put stuff in here. So if I put in eLearning Brothers, I have to be able to spell though, .com, right? You'll notice once I've made that selection, if I pop it up in a new window, now I can set some options for how that window opens. So these get really granular. These targets get really specific. If I want to change contents, I get both what do I want to change and what do I want to change it to. And if it's not already in the title, I can go out and grab it from my media or locate the file on my computer. All of these different options, if I'm talking about media and I want to play or pause media, it's going to give me a list of all the different media that are in my course. If I want to launch a program, it's going to give me a special flyout where I can choose what file. This course does not have any files attached, so there's nothing there. If I want to open an attachment, again, I can go out and find an attachment on my computer and drop that in here. So this is very context specific. Just like these are keyed to where am I as far as triggering something and what's available from my current page, this target is based on what sort of action you choose. The last part of an action is conditions. And we're going to talk about this in just a couple of seconds along with some of these other items like run action group and things. But you can tell an action, I only want you to run when certain things, certain conditions are met or certain conditions exist. And we'll look at that at just a second. Real quick, I do want to look at, and this is kind of a throwback to something we talked about in the basics webinar, is the order that actions appear. So you'll notice as I come to a page and I add actions, they just kind of drop in here right under what I'm looking at. But these actions run in order. So if I'm adding new stuff and I want it to happen after the actions that are already on there, I need to drag them down because actions run from top to bottom. So this on-show reset ELB variable, that's going to be the first action that runs when this page loads. Then on-show disable button 1 is going to run after this one. Then show animate buttons is going to run after this one. And then on-show none, on-show none. Anything else I add that I drag to the bottom will run after these. If I leave these at the top, they're going to run before these. The reason this is important to understand is because sometimes you want an action to run after other actions. So you want to make sure you drag them into the right place. The most prominent or the most, I think, drastic example of this I can think of would be a go-to action. If I have an action that says on show, go to next page, and that's the first action on my button or on my page, nothing else is going to run. This whole page will flicker up for a second and then it'll jump to the next page in the course. So I better make sure this action is at the very bottom of my list. Otherwise, nothing else is going to run because the first thing that happens is I'm jumping away to another page. The same thing is true on a button. If I were to have a couple of different actions on this next button and I wanted to say, open an attachment. I don't know why I'd want that on the next button. Do something else. Let's say I wanted to change contents of a text box. I wanted to hide an object on the page, and then I wanted to go to another page. If that go-to action is first, nothing else on this button will happen. If, however, I drag it to the bottom, it's going to run last. Now, that being said, and this is going to lead into our next conversation about variables, right? if I have some actions here like, oh, modifying a variable, setting a variable, resetting variables, right? And then I have some sort of other action, a next, and it's based on a condition. I definitely want that last action to come last. And if you notice that you're playing with variables and you're playing with actions, and even if you set up the order correctly here, we don't get the right amount of weight between when this happens and when this happens. And we'll look at an example of this here in a second. That's when I can come back up here to this trigger delay. And I can add a little bit of artificial delay in the form of fractions of a second or whole seconds. So if I wanted to change a variable, change contents of something, and then I wanted to show or hide some other element, and then I wanted to wait before we jump to the next page, I can add an artificial delay to any action on here. So I could say, change the contents of something, then show me something, right? Maybe I wanted to show a specific text box after I've changed its contents. And then I wanted to wait to let people see that change. I can add that delay using the delay function here. So we've looked at the 4 parts of an action, the basics. So we've got a trigger, what happens, the order of that trigger, of that action, and this delay determines when that action happens in relation to the other actions. The second and third parts are the action itself, what I want to happen, and what I want to do specifically. So do I want to go to a different page? If so, which page do I want to go to? And then conditions. Conditions are, again, do I want this action to only happen if certain criteria exist? So now that we've kind of looked at the specific parts of an action, what we want to look at now are kind of 2 things that sort of go together. One of them is action groups, and one of them is specifics of how these conditionals work. So real quick, I want to talk about an action group. You'll notice that here I have some tabs, right, on the side, and each one of these has a button attached to it. I'll scroll down a little bit here so you guys can see that. And some of the actions on these buttons are very specific to this tab. For example, the content, the action that says, show the content of this tab, I only want that to happen for this one tab. For tab 2, I'll want to show the content for section 2. For tab 3, I'll want to show the content for tab 3. I want those to be specific actions to these tabs. But there are things that I will want to happen regardless of which button I click. For example, resetting all of the content, hiding the content. I may not have this program to know which tab I'm currently on, so whichever tab button I click, I may want to say, hey, listen, just hide any content that's showing on the screen. Now, if I were to code into each button, hide tab 1, hide tab 2, hide tab 3, hide tab 4, hide tab 5, hide tab 6, and then let's say I change the number of tabs. I would have to go to every button and remove that hide tab 6 option. Or if I was going to show something every time I click the tab, like this background, let's say I had another action that hit it. And so anytime you click the tab, I wanted to make sure it was shown. Again, if I made a global change and I had individual actions on every button, I would have to go to every button to change it. So anything that I want to happen every time I click any button, I put those actions at the top of the page, right-click them and say group. That puts them all into an action group. And there actually is a specific type of action called run action group. So let's say, for example, I wanted to run that group, right? I could come up here and add an action that says, on mouse click, run action group. And then it's going to give me a list of all the groups on my page, and I can choose to run all of these actions just by selecting that group and run action group. That way, if I do make a global change to how this page works, I can come back here to this action group, change something in one place, delete a single action. I could add a whole new action, and I only have to do it in this group, and that filters down to everywhere I've said run action group. So groups of actions are your best friend when it comes to, I have something that I want to do every time I click any one of these tabs or any one of these buttons, but I don't want to have to micromanage how all of those individual buttons work if I make a global change. So action groups are a way to kind of group things that you would want to do over and over again. And we actually do have a blog post, and this is grouping actions together in Lectora, out on our eLearning Brothers blog site. So if you come out to the site, you click search, and just type in Lectora group, it will pull up this blog post as one of your results. And this kind of walks you through the process of grouping actions. So if you do need a refresher on this, this blog post is out there along with a bunch of other good ones, so feel free to go grab it and take a look. The other thing we want to look at is conditionals. We've looked at what the parts of an action are, how we build an action. We've looked at delaying the action if we need to. We've even looked at building groups of actions. So the next thing we want to look at is conditionals. What if I only want that action to run under certain conditions? And this works at page level actions. It works at title level actions. It works at group actions. So you can have a group, and some of these may only run if a certain condition exists. Some of these might run all the time. You'll notice if you have conditions attached to an action, this icon changes. You get the little question mark. It looks like a flowchart, decision-making point, and you get a little question mark there. If you don't have a condition, that's grayed out, and your action looks like it just runs straight through. So that's a quick little way to jump through your actions and see if you have anything that's conditional or not. So if you wonder if a condition is on an action, just look for that icon to change. And then for a preview, you can just mouse over it, and it'll give you a little pop-up of what that action condition is. Now, a condition, again, is a way to limit whether or not an action is going to run. Let's say, for example, I only wanted to go to the next page if you had already clicked on all of the tabs. You had viewed all the content here. So I wanted to lock that next button down to, I only want this to work if my learner has seen all the content on this page. I can do that through a condition. I would need to set up, and this will lead very nicely into our next discussion, I would want to set up a variable to track what's been clicked and what hasn't. And then I can look at that variable and say, hey, listen, if that variable indicates I have clicked all the items on this page, then I want this action to trigger. Otherwise, I might want to do nothing. I might want to do a different action. So let's just pick something here. We're going to go in here and we're going to look at ELB tab. And again, we'll go into variables in just a second here. And I might say, I want to look and see if it contains something. I want to see if it doesn't contain something, if it's specifically equal to, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, if it's empty, if it's not empty, if it's not equal to. So I can look at all of those conditions, and I can give it a specific value, or I can even refer to another variable and check one variable against another. Once I've set a condition, and I'm just going to type some gibberish in here so that it will give us a condition that we can look at. Once I've typed that in, you'll notice then I unlock a whole new section called else action. And this is where I was saying you can set a condition and say, if this condition is true, I want to do this action. If not, or else, I want to do another action. If I leave this on none, nothing's going to happen unless this condition is met, and then it'll do this. If I put another action in here, right, another go-to action, I might say, if this condition is met, I go to the next page. If it's not met, I might go to a different page. Or I might give them a pop-up message. Please view all the tab content on this page before proceeding. That way I'm giving them a prompt as to why that button is not working. So that's what conditionals do. And we'll go back to conditionals in just a little bit, but what have I brought up that we need to talk about? I've brought up variables. And variables are the other thing that give people heartburn and respiratory distress, all sorts of horrible feelings deep down in the pit of their soul when they start thinking about Lectora. A lot of people start thinking when they start their path into rapid e-learning development, they go into it because they're not programmers. And when you say variable, immediately people start thinking, oh, I have to learn how to program. That's not true. You can use programming with variables in Lectora. Let's say, for example, that you were really into JavaScript, right? Yes, there is JavaScript. There are JavaScript actions that you can do if you want to when you come into Lectora. Let's see, I saw one earlier. There we go. So here's some JavaScript for you. Yeah, you can get this crazy, but you don't have to. Variables exist inside of Lectora even if you don't know how to program. Think of a variable as a bucket, just an empty bucket sitting on the floor. And you could put stuff into that bucket. It's just a container. You can change the contents of that container without changing the name or the placement of that container. Let me put it to you this way. Let's say I put a bucket in the corner of the room, right, and it happens to be a very sanitary, very clean bucket. I could fill that bucket with confetti. I could fill that bucket with water. I could fill that bucket with wine. I could fill that bucket with dirt. I could fill that bucket with cement. I could fill that bucket with money, right? I could fill that bucket with blocks, little alphabet blocks. I could fill that bucket with anything I wanted to. And anytime I wanted to learn about the contents of that bucket, I wouldn't have to say, I need some confetti. I need X amount of confetti. Where am I going to find that confetti? All I'd have to do to get confetti, if that's what's kept in that bucket, is tell anybody else in the room, bring me that bucket, and the contents come with it. It doesn't matter what they are. The contents of that bucket is what I'm interested in. But I can get at those contents simply by saying I want that bucket. Let's say I needed lots of different items. I needed confetti and cement and dirt and alphabet blocks. I can have buckets of different colors or different shapes or different sizes. And by referring to that bucket, I would get the contents specific to that bucket. Bring me the red bucket. Bring me the bucket that's labeled text. Bring me the bucket that's labeled have I clicked on a tab. Bring me the bucket that's labeled mathematical equation, right? By referring to the bucket, again, I get the contents. So up here on my ribbon in Lectora, and again, I think I saw this, yes, this is Lectora 16 that I'm working in. But these particular, even though the specifics of some of these actions and some of the things that I'm doing, the specifics might change if you're in 12 or 11 or even as far back as 10. The fundamental rules that we're learning, how an action is built, how a conditional is built, how a variable works, those apply to every version of Lectora. So I'm going to click on Tools up here in my ribbon, and I'm going to click Variables. There's a Resource Manager and there's a Variable Manager. This is going to show me a list of all the variables in my course and where they're used. So right now, I only have one user-defined variable, one bucket, to put things in, and that's the ELB underscore tab bucket. So anytime I refer in an action or in a condition or even in a text box, if I say, hey, give me what's in ELB underscore tab, whatever is in that bucket, I can access it. I can read it. I can look at it. I can manipulate it. I don't have to know what it is. All I have to do is ask for that bucket. And that's where variables really come in handy, because I don't have to know what's in there. All I have to know is that bucket exists, what is its name, and then I just call for it. I just ask for something to bring me that bucket. So ELB tab is our bucket for this particular interaction. And what I can do is I can store things in there and then bounce conditions off of it. So when I click tab 1, right, I can go into that bucket, right? I'm going to click on this action. I'm going to click the action on the ribbon. I'm going to say when I click on the mouse, I want to modify a variable. The variable I want to modify is my ELB tab bucket. And I want to set it equal to 1. I've just said this is the tab that I'm looking at. So now anytime from any other action I call that ELB tab button, I now know exactly what tab I'm in without having to actually know what tab I'm in. All I did was ask for the bucket. I look in the bucket, there's a 1 in there, I know what tab I'm on. When I'm in tab number 2, I set that variable to 2. So at any point in this interaction, I now know what tab I'm in just by looking in that bucket. So thinking about these variables, there are a couple of best practices that you want to consider. The first one is you want your buckets, your variables, to be unique, to have a unique name. For example, if I wanted to create a new variable, I would not want to give it the same name as my existing variable. And as a matter of fact, if I do, Lectora is going to fuss at me. It's going to say, hey, you can't use a bucket name that's already there. That would be confusing. Why don't you call it something else? So I might have a variable that says ELB tab that tells me what tab I'm on. If I want to know what tabs I'm visited, maybe I make my new variable called ELB visited tabs. Oh, and that one works. So your names for your variables, for your buckets, need to be unique. The other one is you want to be consistent in the way you name them. So let's go back to our tools variables. We're going to look at these variable names. So this one is pretty specific. ELB visited tabs. ELB tab is not quite as specific. If I want to use the same sort of naming convention, and naming convention is something you hear programmers and developers use to refer to how you choose your names for objects, for variables, for actions, I want to be consistent. So if this indicates my visited tabs, then this one needs to be called current tab. And again, I have to be able to spell. So now I have two different variables, current tab and visited tab. Now, you'll notice that here I did change a variable name. I'm sure somebody is about to have a heart attack and say, wait a minute, does that mean I have to go back and change all the instances of that variable? If you come into Tools Variable Manager and you change the name of a variable here, the answer is no. It will automatically update all of the usage in this table everywhere I've used that variable name. So the big takeaway from this is your most important things are unique variable names and a consistent pattern in naming your variables. So as you're going through and naming things, you want to be consistent in the way you name them. That helps not only you, it helps somebody who might come along after you and want to alter your course. It helps you if you go on to work on another project and come back to this later. So you want to be consistent and you want to be unique in your names. The other thing is, if you can come up with a scheme for naming your variables that you can use across all the courses you're going to develop, that will help you in the long run as you do jump between courses. So unique, consistent, and then something that works across all your courses. Let's say, for example, you had a couple of courses that all used a tab style interaction. What you may want to do is start naming your interaction variables, right? Stuff that's specific to an interaction in a course with a name. So let's say this is the ELB course or ELB interaction. I have 2 chapters, or I'm in the second chapter, right? The second section, right? And the let's third section and the 5th page. So maybe your naming convention is course abbreviation, section, chapter number, section number, page number, and then the name for that variable. The reason this is important is, what if you had 2 tab interactions in the same course? Well, you can't use ELB current tab on both of them. You would need something specific to that page, and that's where that uniqueness comes in. So course name, chapter, section, page, variable name. So that's the quick and dirty best practices on using variables. There are a couple of other things that I want to show you that are kind of more tips and tricks for using variables. And this will bring us back full circle to how variables work with actions, specifically in thinking about conditionals. So let's go back to these and take a look. So if we have an interaction, right, that has a condition, and I pulled our condition from here, so better go back in here and add one back in. If we have an action and we want to base it on a condition, on something in a variable, so I want to show some content only if my current tab is equal to 1 or equal to 2 or equal to 3. What I want to do is I want to make sure that in every instance, and this is my mindset, this is how I develop, it's how all of our developers work in a title, and it's what we use not only in Lectora, but also in Storyline, also in Captivate. In any tool we work in, there are 2 different ways that you can use a variable inside of an action. One is explicit, and one is mathematical. And by that, I mean, I can either say, does this variable contain a specific value? Or I can say, I want to increment, decrement, add to, subtract from, multiply, divide. I want to do some sort of math on a variable. That most often happens when you're talking about scoring or tracking progression through a number of steps. Does that kind of make sense to you guys? A lot of times this is where people start getting confused with variables, is I either want to have a variable where I'm concerned with doing math, or everything else. And in everything else, I mean I'm going to look for a very specific value, or I'm going to look for something specific in the bucket. Going back to our bucket analogy, maybe that's a better way to do it. I'm either going to mix up something in the bucket, right? Pour a bunch of stuff in and start stirring, or I'm going to look for something specific in the bucket. I'm going to want to pour the contents out and kind of look through it for a specific value. I want to make sure I plan which one of those I want to do way up front. The reason is, once I start mixing in a bucket, pulling something specific out becomes nearly impossible. Think about that. If you went into your kitchen and you started baking cookies, and you looked into that batter and said, I want to pull out just the flour. Once you've thrown in eggs and, and sugar and butter and that kind of stuff, like, you're done as far as pulling out flour goes. Or if you just want to get the brown sugar or the chocolate chips back out, at that point you've done something that you can't go back from. So you'll want to decide up front, is this a variable where I'm going to need to look for a specific element, a specific ingredient, or is this a variable where I'm going to be okay doing some math, doing some adding, subtracting, and dividing? And you're going to want to make sure you only do math on math variables, and you only do checks for specific contents on, explicit variables. Here, we're looking for a specific condition. The only thing we ever do is set that current tab equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. That means the only thing we should ever check for is there a 1? Is there a 2? Is there a 3? Is there a 4? Is there a 5? Is there a 6? If I wanted to have something where I was doing math, like how many tabs have I visited, I would want to create a separate variable for that. I would not want to manipulate current tab to try and come up with that. The other thing we want to look at is this list of variables. So in this list, and this is a tip and trick that not only works with variables, it actually works with assets as well. If I've gone in here and I've created a, let's say, current tab variable, and I now have 30, 40, 50 actions that I want to go through, but I know I'm going to need to, in every one, refer to that current tab variable, or let's say I have a change contents action. And I'm going to want to change the contents of something over and over and over again to another resource. I might not want to go through the trouble of, especially if I have a huge course and I have 200-300 assets, going through the list of where that asset is alphabetically, or in a condition, going through that list to where my variable is listed alphabetically is kind of a bit of a bear. There's a secret way to get your variable to the top of the list temporarily so that you can get to it quickly. And this works again on variables and on assets. So I go to my tools, I click on variables, I find the variable that I want to move to the top of the list, and I prefix it with an underscore. Remember, it automatically updates all of the instances of that, but look what happens when I go in here now, and I go to Actions, I click on Variables, look what's at the top of my list, the variable that I just put an underscore in front of. So now, every single list of variables in my title has that underscored item at the very top. So I don't have to go looking for it. So now, I can go through to all of my conditions, really quickly grab that variable, if it's not the one that's already selected, then I can go back into Tools, Variables, and change that name back to what it should be. The same thing works with resources. If I have a bunch of images in here, I have a bunch of attachments, a bunch of audio files, and I want to move one to the top of a list, I can just prefix it with an underscore, and it's now going to be at the top of every single list of images, every single list of audio files, if it were an audio file, whatever I have put that underscore, it's going to move to the top of all of that kind of item in any list in my title. So that's a good tip or trick for when you're in your variables, you're in your actions, and you have a ridiculously long list of assets, and you want to get something to propagate to the top. That's how you can get that done. So we've looked at actions, we've looked at variables, we've looked at kind of how those two work together. We've looked at some best practices for both of those. I'm going to show you a couple of blog posts that you can go out and look at. One of them is one that I wrote. It's called Building a Better Next Button. And this talks about, again, I know you guys hate variables and actions, but they're really not that bad once you get in there and start talking about it. It's got some step-by-step ways that you can use variables and actions to make your next button smart without having to rewrite your next button every time you change the number of pages or you change how your course is laid out. We talk about, how to make that next button disappear from the last page in a chapter or section. And this works independently of what the actual last page is. So let's say in my title, I have 5 or 6 pages. Yes, I could come in and disinherit a title level next button. What happens if I get 3 pages added by my instructional designer? Or my boss comes and says, now we want to add another section. I would have to go in and manually disinherit that button, add it back in. Using a little bit of action and a little bit of variables, I can say, hey, if the current page in this section or this chapter is equal to the last, the number of pages. In other words, if I'm on page 10 of 10 in this section, I want to hide the next button, right? Then, no matter how many pages I add, it's only going to work if it's the last page in the section. I do mention order of actions in here. So that little tip I gave about, ordering your actions and using a delay, that becomes important. Thinking about that, if we were to do some manipulation on a variable and we were noticing that our actions didn't seem to work in the right order, I might want to wait to do that math variable at the very end and add a little bit of delay. Um, so that's where that would come back into play. One of the other things you might want to look at is how to dynamically target actions. And this is kind of like a step up leading into the next webinar we're going to do, which is intermediate, advanced, expert kind of actions in Lectora. So we talk a little bit about grouping actions, and we point to that blog post, but this talks about specifically those conditions and how I can set those conditions, and even how I can go in there and use a variable in these conditions. Like, there's all kinds of craziness you can get into. So dynamically targeted actions, building a better next button. If you want to get into how these templates are built, you can go over here into your Inspire tools. That'll open your eLearning Brothers library. Again, I'm not logged in, so have it pulled up here. And you can come into these interactions, and you can pull them into your title, and you can download some of those. Why is it being mean to me? Oh, it's because I'm on a recorded webinar, and that's why. So you can actually pull in some, oh, it's because I'm not logged in on my other guy, isn't it? Okay, so you can come into the eLearning Brothers library through Lectora, drag some of these onto your stage, and go look at these interactions. Go look at these variables. Go look at how we run this action group, when we run that group, what we're running that group for, what happens inside of that group, how we manipulate these variables. And this will give you a really good idea of the power of these actions, how you can tie them into different things, and even how you can use them to start manipulating variables and start, because of those variable states and how you've manipulated them, how you can kind of circle back around to that. And again, we'll go into a lot of specific examples of how we accomplish things using these sort of best practices and how we use actions and variables to achieve specific results. We'll look at a chess game that one of our developers started building, and some blog posts that are built around that. We only have about 10, maybe 12 minutes left, and I do want to hop out and start getting into some of the questions that you guys have posted into the chat box, because it would not be nice of me to not go into that. So I'm going to start looking through these. Zach, I see that you've commented on a couple of these, but I wanted to make sure that you were still around and see how you were doing as we start answering questions.
Yes, I answered some of the more basic ones, but I left the advanced ones to the master.
Oh no, that means I have to do the hard stuff. That's okay. I got no problem with that. So Suzanne had asked at one point, is this being shown in Lectora 16? Yes, this is Lectora 16, but you actually can do variable and action manipulation in 11 and in 12 as well. You may notice there are some things like the states option won't appear when you're as far back as Lectora 11. When you go into, let's go into the button action so that we've got a little. So set state will not be available prior to, like if you go back to Lectora 11. So some of these options may change in your list, but the fundamental of how variables and actions work and how they interact with each other, that won't change, when you go back to some of those older ones. Is there a limitation to using JavaScript code when publishing for tablet mobile? The only caveat I would say there, the only issue you would have with JavaScript is if you were doing something that natively a tablet or a mobile device cannot do. In other words, if it's JavaScript that you could write on a regular web page and it would work properly on a tablet or on a mobile device, then that JavaScript action will work from inside of Lectora. If you're trying to do something that just can't be done from a JavaScript perspective on a device, like if you were trying to force a multimedia file to play on an iOS device, iOS won't let you auto start media without some really tricky back-end workarounds, and then you can cause some issues with the device. So that sort of stuff wouldn't work. But your basic JavaScript, your standard JavaScript library, pretty much everything in jQuery and GreenSock. You'll notice we use a lot of GreenSock tween and stuff like that. Those will all work from inside of Lectora. If I wanted to add a JavaScript function action to the page, can you demonstrate where I would do that? Yeah, absolutely. So we've actually got one built in here. Let's see, where was it? Was it further down here? Oh, it was up here on animate buttons. So if I wanted to add a JavaScript function to a button or a page, I would do it like this. I would do a new action. I would set it to whatever trigger I wanted, whether it's a keystroke or a button click or just on show of the page. For my action, I would choose run JavaScript, and then I hate this little target window it gives you. There's a little button in the bottom right corner you can click to pop up a bigger window, and you can even resize this guy to give you more real estate. So if you have a tool you like writing your JavaScript in, for me, that's Notepad++ because it does some wonderful color coding when I'm writing. I might write my JavaScript as a separate file, save it somewhere else, so that I have all of the. Let me show you guys this. This is Notepad++. It's a free tool. It's just a basic script editor. If I were to save this out to my desktop as JavaScript example, right? Oh, I saved it as a text file. Silly me. I would want to save it as a JavaScript file. You'll notice it starts to color code and format my file, so it helps me to write JavaScript a little bit better. If I write my script outside, I can just copy and paste that straight into this window in Lectora. If I want to, I can write it right here inside Lectora, click OK. At this point, my JavaScript is in here. When this trigger happens, that JavaScript is going to run. How do you use Google Fonts? That's actually something that's built into this template. We can pull this up and look at this in a separate instance, or actually, Zach, that might make a good blog post. Let me make myself a note. Blog post on using Google Fonts.
I love that idea.
Basically, Google Fonts are web kits, web-based fonts, and we may have some blog posts that touch on this already. Zach, do you know if we do off the top of your head?
I don't think we do of using the Google fonts, so that's a great one to write.
So basically, for those of you who don't know, Google maintains a repository of fonts kind of accessible online that you can use on your web pages. All you have to do is point to it. So there is a way that you can actually point to the Google Fonts library and choose a font, a specific font to use. And when you do that, it's going to use that font on your Lectora title on the target computer, even if they don't have that font installed, because again, it's kind of hosted on Google stuff. Basically, it's just a insert HTML extension that gets you this guy. When you go into his properties, you just choose custom div, and then Google Fonts, will give you, if you go to fonts.google.com, it will show you how to do, give you the code that you need to put in, and you just copy and paste it into there. But we'll write up a blog post on that. I'll get with Zach after the webinar and come up with a good blog post, and maybe we can work that in this week or next week. We can work it into our authorship rotation. But that's a good question. Can you use a variable array within Lectora native capabilities, or is it JavaScript required? That's one that would require JavaScript. And an array would be like a bucket with dividers in it, where you can store lots of different things, lots of different variables sort of inside a variable. Think of it like a table, right? Where you could say, I'm going to have a bunch of different variables in this bucket, but I want to keep them separated out and stored in the same manner. So kind of like a layered bucket with little dividers in it, like a tool caddy, where you would say, okay, on the first level of this bucket, I'm going to have a name, maybe a size, a condition. Like I'll have a bunch of different little specific pieces. If you want, go out and Google array if you're not familiar with them. and it will teach you about that. But to tap an array, you would definitely need to use some JavaScript programming, Suzanne. Um, the web address for the grouping actions, Zach has put that in there into the answer for the question, so that should be good. Um, blog posts accessible to everyone? Yes, they are. Does Lectora include a randomized variable or function? There's not one really built in. If you're talking about inside the quiz engine, then yes, you can choose to randomize answers and randomize questions. But as far as randomizing variables, you would need to pull a little bit of JavaScript in for that. Um, does Lectora page reset when revisited? Variables global for the title or unique to a page? That comes back to, so that's kind of two questions. The answer to the first part is, does Lectora page reset when revisited? If you don't use any variables, every time you land on a page, it'll be like the first time you landed there. You can use variables and actions to force a page to remember whether or not you've been there before, and you can use Lectora's native page tracking for that, or you can build your own set of variables and store some information. And if you store information in a variable, that's saved as a cookie on the learner's machine, so you can remember. As long as they haven't cleared their cookies, it'll remember their variables from the last time they were there. As far as are variables global for the title or unique to a page, variables are global to a title, which is why a unique name is so important. So if I have a variable in my title, excuse me, that variable exists on every chapter, every section, every page. So I need to give it a specific name if I want it to be unique to a page. Otherwise, I could use a variable and give it a very unique, very global name, a very broad name, and not put a chapter, page, or section name in there. And what that would do was it would in effect allow me to track actions across all of the pages just by giving it a broad name. So maybe that variable is something that I do math on. Every time I go to a specific page, I'm keeping a tally or keeping a cumulative score. Because I can, because these variables are global. The only way I can delineate to myself or identify to myself as a learner, as a developer, whether or not that variable is specific to the page is in the naming. So hopefully that answers that block of questions. And I think sort these by. Okay, we got one more question, and we got about 2 minutes left. So if you use it on a tablet or mobile device, is the variable info still stored as a cookie? Yes, it is. It's stored as a cookie on their web browser. Now, you can, if you, it's going to open up a whole nother can of worms that might be a webinar for later. If you use XAPI or Tincan and you have an LRS as opposed to an LMS, you can store a lot more information there. Depending on your LMS, you may be able to store some information there. That would be something that's specific to you as a developer and specific to your company and their LMS. So that's one that's not really within the scope of a regular webinar because it would be specific to each individual and their LMS and their implementation. So that one's kind of tougher to address. But yes, it's basically Lectora's generating web pages. So anything that you save as a variable is saved just basically in a cookie in the learner's web browser. And I think that's about all the time we have for this week. So that's your big primer on actions and variables. And then looking into our next webinar, I think the next segue is going to be showing some specific examples of that. And Zach, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Adam, thank you so much for doing that. And we wanted to thank everybody who joined us on this webinar. Listen, as a reminder, Adam showed you a lot of great things that you can do. If you're a subscriber to Lectora, then you already have access to a lot of these assets within the tool. He showed you how to put those in right there. However, we have a lot of different libraries that are available to you, including cutout people, different stock assets, videos, photos, those types of things. If you're interested in that and you're a Lectora user, contact your Lectora sales rep and talk to them about adding more subscriptions to your library. If you're not a Lectora user, give us a call at 801-796-2767, and we'd love to put together a package for you to really just help you out in all of your e-learning asset needs. We have different volume discounts and things like that, so please feel free to give us a call. Also, these recordings will be available on our blog. That's at elearningbrothers.com. You can check out our support site, which is support.elearningbrothers.com. And of course, you can always send us an email, which is support@elearningbrothers.com. We hope that you enjoyed this webinar. Please feel free to check out our events page to find out when the next webinar will be and what that topic is, and we hope to see you then. Thanks very much, guys. Have a great day.